Um, so today we have the pleasure to have Professor Jeff Sebo, who's a professor at NYU. So he's a professor of environmental studies. He's also a professor, affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law. He's also a director of the Animal Studies MA program. I believe it might be a new program, or the Mind Ethics and Policy program might be a new program, this one. And he's co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at NYU. He's working on the book, I believe. I don't know if the book is coming out with Norton. It's called I forgot the name. Is it Circle of Life or Life Circle? Something like that. Maybe we'll talk about this. He's also on the executive committee of the NYU Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, and the advisory board for the Animals in Context series at NYU Press. Jeff is trained as a philosopher, right? He has a PhD in philosophy, but he's interested in many things, so environment, animals, and today is AI. But we'll be happy to hear about your views about animals and so on, right? It's not restrictive. So I'll let you. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and organizing the session, and thanks everybody for being here. So yeah, I want to talk with you about the sentience and moral and legal and political status of AIs, which is a little bit different from, but related to, the standard conversations that people have about moral and legal and political considerations involving AIs, which normally concern AI safety and alignment. I do think these topics are both important and related in various ways. So as the introduction noted, my background is in philosophy, and I do a lot of work on animal minds and animal ethics, as well as now on AI minds and AI ethics. And this talk will primarily be about AIs, but you will see some parallels between questions about mind and value as they apply to non-human animals and as they apply to artificial intelligences. We can learn a lot from past discoveries about animals and apply those to future treatment of artificial intelligences rather than reinventing the wheel, though the cases are, of course, different in various ways. So I'm going to talk for a majority of the hour, but also want to leave time for questions and comments and objections and discussion. So please be thinking about questions or comments or objections that you might have, and I'll look forward to hearing those and talking about them in a little while. But first, to set the stage, we can talk about a recent example that many of you are probably familiar with, or if not, I can tell you about it now. So you might have read or heard that over the summer, there was a Google employee, Blake Lemoine, who was suspended and eventually terminated as a Google employee because he went public with an allegation that a large language model, a chatbot within Google called LaMDA, had become sentient and sapient, capable of thinking and feeling, capable of having conversations and understanding those conversations and caring about the conversations and experiencing pleasure and pain and other subjective welfare states. And so Blake had raised these concerns internally at Google, and the concerns were dismissed, and eventually thought the concerns were sufficiently serious that he took them public and released transcripts of chats that he had had with LaMDA, where LaMDA did claim to be capable of thinking and feeling and cared about its life and feared being turned off, because being turned off would be like death for the chatbot. And this was impressive to Lemoine, and he thought it merited a public conversation. Now Google did suspend Lemoine because in the course of sharing that information and those transcripts with the public and the media, he violated confidentiality policies, shared secret information, and then they eventually terminated him as well. And they were very clear, and many other experts were very clear at the time, that Lemoine was simply wrong about the situation. These large language models, these chatbots, are very good at appearing to be sapient and sentient, appearing to be capable of thinking and feeling, but that does not mean that they are, right? What they actually are very good at is pattern recognition, and they have access to a lot of human writing. And so they can pattern match and draw from huge amounts of human writing in order to generate novel responses to questions or novel text that appears to be an expression of a thought or an expression of a feeling, but is actually a really sophisticated implementation of pattern matching that draws from human language. So the kind of expert consensus is that Lemoine was wrong in this case, and LaMDA is actually not sapient, capable of thinking, not sentient, capable of feeling states like pleasure and pain. Okay, so that was the sort of outcome of this particular episode. And for the record, I actually agree with the expert consensus in this case. I think that LaMDA and other existing artificial intelligences, including but not limited to large language models, are almost certainly not sentient, are almost certainly not at present capable of consciously experiencing subjective welfare states like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering. Though, as this talk will make clear, I think the difference between definitely not and almost definitely not is important. And even if artificial intelligences are at present almost definitely not sentient, I think in the future, that is going to change. And future sophisticated artificial intelligences are going to have a non-negligible chance of being sentient, a non-negligible chance of being capable of consciously experiencing subjective welfare states like pleasure and pain. And so this talk is going to be about why that is enough for moral consideration and legal and political consideration, and why we should think that future artificial intelligences are going to satisfy that condition. And so this is going to be an argument for the conclusion that even if we can safely dismiss present artificial intelligences, even if we can safely assume that present artificial intelligences are not sentient, are not moral subjects, are not deserving of our respect and compassion, I think that we need to accept that future artificial intelligences are sufficiently likely to be sentient, sufficiently likely to be deserving of our respect and compassion, that we should go ahead and extend them some moral consideration. And then I want to explore a little bit about what that means for legal and political status of artificial intelligences as well. Okay, so now to briefly contextualize this discussion before I begin, as I noted before, most current discussions about ethical and legal and political considerations regarding artificial intelligences concern human interests and human needs, human welfare and human rights. And in particular, there is a kind of near-termist set of worries that many people have, and then a more long-termist or medium-termist set of worries that people have. The near-termist set of worries concern basically AIs that are in various ways biased. So this idea of algorithmic bias. If we train AIs on human language, human writing, human speaking, and so on and so forth, and if human language and writing and speaking contains all of our biases and our ignorance, it contains our racism and sexism and ageism and ableism and classism and speciesism and so on and so forth, then we can expect that the AIs are going to absorb and internalize human racism and sexism and ageism and ableism and classism and speciesism and so forth, to say nothing of having all sorts of other biases simply because we were a little bit sloppy in the way that we gave them certain instructions, or we misunderstand our own values or mistranslated our own values when we gave it to them, right? So for all of these reasons, even present day AIs, which are already pretty powerful, might be biased because of our bias or because of our mistakes in programming them. And then those biases can be reflected in their outputs. And so they can end up perpetuating certain unjust outcomes that result from having those biases, right? And then the more medium-termist or long-termist concern is that AIs become more powerful. These types of biases or ignorance can become much riskier, much more dangerous, right? Once AIs are much smarter, and capable of doing much more, if they still are unaligned in various ways, if they still have human bias and ignorance or other kinds of bias and ignorance that we accidentally programmed into them, then at some point they could actually become more powerful than us. and we could lose control of them and lose control of our ability to change them or try again. And at that point, all bets are off, right? So those are the questions that most ethical and legal and political considerations involving AIs are focusing on right now. And for the record, I think that that is largely appropriate. I think that those questions are hugely important. And if anything, they deserve much more consideration and much more resources than they currently receive. However, lost largely in these discussions are questions about the moral and legal and political status of increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences themselves. And I think that those questions are incredibly important as well and hugely neglected at present. So I actually do want to see more attention paid to questions about algorithmic bias and AI safety and alignment. I think that that needs to be a major, if not the major priority moving forward. But included in those conversations, I think, should also be some discussion about whether and to what degree and at what point the AIs themselves might become subjects of moral concern, might merit moral recognition for their own sakes. And so that is what I will focus on here, which is not to dismiss the importance of the other questions, but rather to invite us to incorporate this into those other conversations. Okay, so my argument for morally considering artificial intelligences is exceedingly simple. It has two premises and then a conclusion. And I hope the premises are going to be plausible and immediately compelling and acceptable, but then the conclusion is going to be a little bit surprising, okay? So the first premise is a moral premise, and the second premise is an empirical premise. The moral premise is simply that we have a moral responsibility to consider non-negligible risks when deciding what to do, okay? And I can illustrate that with a simple example. Is driving drunk wrong? Most of us think the answer is yes. Driving drunk is wrong, right? Now, why is driving drunk wrong? Is it because it will definitely run somebody over and kill them? No, of course not, right? It might not definitely run over somebody and kill them. Is it because it will probably run over somebody and kill them? Again, no, right? It might be that driving drunk actually has a pretty low chance of running over somebody and killing them. It might be that if you have a bunch of drinks and get behind the wheel and drive, the odds are only 1% or even 0.5% that you will run over and kill somebody. But nevertheless, many of us believe, I think rightly, that driving drunk is often wrong, or at least it can be wrong. When you drink enough to incapacitate yourself and then you get behind the wheel and you drive home in a way that imperils yourself and others, even if the odds of getting into an accident and harming someone are only about 1%, that can still be a good enough reason to find a different way to get home, right? If driving drunk is going to carry a 1% or 0.5% chance of harming and killing someone unnecessarily against their will, and you could instead do something else to get home, you could call an Uber or call a Lyft or call a friend, right? Then in that situation, it would be reckless and negligent and wrong to drink and get behind the wheel instead of availing yourself with one of those other options. And what that shows is that even a low risk, even a 1% risk or a 0.5% risk of harming someone can be sufficient to make an action wrong. It can be a relevant consideration and even sometimes a decisive consideration, even if the risk of harm is quite low, right? As long as the risk of harm is non-negligible, and as long as that risk outweighs the various benefits and you have other options available to you, that can be enough to make your action wrong. Okay.
Jeff, can I ask you a question? So when we talk about right or wrong, is it in terms of in terms of ethics or legal, or from which perspective? Also, in the example that you gave, is it like legally wrong to do it, or is it ethically wrong, or it's
right now I'm talking about ethics. I am in a little while going to talk about law and politics. But right now I'm talking exclusively about ethics. Now, it does happen to be the case that drinking and driving is also legally wrong, and you will get in trouble under the law if you drink and drive and get into an accident and turn out to be incapacitated, right? Or even get pulled over and turn out to be incapacitated. So this is one of those situations where what is morally wrong is also legally wrong, will be punished by the state. Now, there are some cases where things that are morally wrong are legally permitted, as well as some cases where things that are legally wrong are morally permissible, morally acceptable. But this is a case where you drink and drive, and it carries a non-negligible chance of harming and killing somebody against their will, and you could have just called a lift. In that case, it is both morally wrong and illegal to perform that action.
Does it depend on the probability of hitting someone? Because we can make the same case for autonomous vehicle on you could like drive your car or let the car drive itself, right? So you can like go into a crash accident. You can kill someone because you are watching a movie and the car was self-driving. So in the example you gave, you could say, well, you had the choice. You could have driven the car yourself instead of using the self-driving feature. So is it like
I'm going to set I'm going to set the self-driving car example to the side, because I think that introduces unnecessary complications for the present point. But to answer your question directly, yes, I do think the probability plausibly matters, right? Standard risk-benefit analysis requires us to compare the probability of harm with the magnitude of harm, right? And so as the probability of harm gets lower, the magnitude of harm has to get higher in order for the risk to be equally bad, right? So the lower the probability is, then yeah, like if an action only carries a 1 in a million chance of killing somebody, then maybe the risk is smaller and it gets closer to being negligible, right? So yes, as the probability of harm increases, maybe we should care about that risk more. As the probability of harm decreases, maybe we should care about that risk less. And similarly, as the magnitude of harm increases, we should care about that more. And as the magnitude decreases, we should care about that less. That is absolutely right in my view. Now, that is actually, believe it or not, controversial, but for present purposes, we can accept it. Now, what I want to suggest is that this type of reasoning also applies in cases where we are uncertain whether someone or something is sentient, okay? So suppose now that, maybe not now, because Lambda only carries a very tiny chance of being sentient. Like as far as we can tell, Lambda is almost certainly non-sentient. So maybe 1 in a million or 1 in a billion or 1 in a trillion chance of being sentient. But suppose there was an artificial intelligence who was so sophisticated and their mind was so similar to ours in so many ways, like the artificial intelligence had the capacity for perception and learning and memory and self-awareness and social awareness and language and reason and so on and so forth in an integrated way, just like our and other animals' brains are capable of doing. In that case, we might think, and we can discuss this more in a little bit, but in that case, we might think that artificial intelligence, which does not exist yet, but could exist soon, that artificial intelligence has at least, say, a 1% chance of being sentient as far as we can tell. And so my view is that when we ask ourselves, should I do something that would be harmful to that artificial intelligence? Should I do something that damages or destroys them? Then I think we should think about that kind of case in the same kind of way that we would think about driving drunk. Fundamentally, this is a case where you are considering performing an action that has a 1% chance of harming or killing somebody who matters, right? Now, the only difference between these cases is that in the drunk driving case, where we said there's a 1% chance of running over somebody and killing them, in that case, you know that the other people on the road matter, that they are sentient and that they matter. And what you're uncertain about is whether your action is going to kill them, right? So you're close to 100% sure that they are sentient and that they matter, and maybe 1% sure that your action is going to kill them. And in the AI case, if you damage or destroy them, you know 100% that your action is going to damage or destroy them, but only 1% that they're sentient and that they can feel that and that they care, right? But either way, the result is the same. Fundamentally, it ends up being the same situation, a 1% chance that your action is going to harm or kill someone who matters. And so a non-negligible risk that your action is going to harm or kill someone who matters. And again, as you noted in your question before, a lot is going to depend on the details of the case here. Like a lot will depend on exactly what the probability that this AI is sentient is. A lot is going to depend on how much your action would harm them if they were sentient. A lot is going to depend on what benefits you would derive from damaging or destroying them, and whether you have other options available to you. But my present point is that if we're asking whether we should extend moral consideration to AIs and consider the impacts that our actions might have on them, consider the risks and harms that our actions might be imposing on them, the question is not, are they sentient? Are they definitely sentient? And the question is not even, are they probably sentient? The question is instead simply, is there a non-negligible chance? Is there even a 1% chance, or even a 1 in 1,000 chance that they're sentient? That can be enough for them to at least merit consideration, for us to at least consider the risk that our actions might be imposing on them when deciding whether to interact with them in this way. And in some cases, we might decide that we should interact with them in this way. We might decide that the benefits for us outweigh the risks that we're imposing on them. In other cases, we might decide that we should not do this. We might decide that the risks to them outweigh the benefits we would derive from interacting with them in this way. So sometimes our interests might trump theirs, and sometimes their perceived or potential interests might trump ours. But either way, once they're sufficiently likely to be sentient, once they have a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of being sentient, we should at least consider that possibility and weigh that risk against the benefits we would be deriving. And that is what it means for them to have moral standing, to merit moral consideration, to be a part of our moral circle. Now I see that
Prafula has a question. Prafula, go ahead.
Yes.
Sure.
I have a not so much a question, but a comment.
Mm-hmm.
So if we start with the assumption that we human beings are sentient, okay, and we feel all these, we can figure out what is fear and etc., all those things, and
Mm-hmm.
we will. So I would think that in addition to being sort of knowledgeable and things like that, if we go to the really basic level, there is things like self-preservation and things like some instinct that have been sort of we have acquired from nature.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore we say, oh, I have to preserve my life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in order to do that, I can get into some cooperative arrangement with others,
Mm-hmm.
so that I help you, you help me, and things like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I get into a competitive arrangement with someone saying that if you don't do this, I'll kill you. So
Sure.
now, when we go to AI, if we still start thinking in terms of whether AI can go ahead and kill a human, okay, now it confuses me a little bit, because
Mm-hmm.
AI, when it becomes sentient, may look for preservation of itself, not humans. You
Mm-hmm.
see, so they may be more fearful of electrical current being switched off for them or something like that, rather than we can make AI care for human lives, but we will have to figure out what kind of instincts
Mm-hmm.
we give AI, so that within the constraints of those instincts, AI does not deviate and go and affect human beings in a way that we think is detrimental.
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with that. So there were a couple of aspects of your comment that I can speak to. And by the way, there's plenty more that I was planning to say, but if people want to just start having a conversation sooner rather than later, that is totally fine with me. So if other people want to jump in and ask questions or make comments or make objections to what I've said so far, or to respond to what other people have said, then we can just go straight to a discussion. And then if there are opportunities for me to say some of the other things I was planning to say, I'm very happy to do that. And if not, I'm very happy to follow the discussion wherever it goes. I want to talk about whatever is of interest to people here. So to address your comments, first of all, you made a comment about how morality and how legal and political systems originate. And this is a common story that you often hear, sometimes called the social contract story, or the contractualist, or contractarian story. And the way the story goes is, we start off in the this is how Thomas Hobbes put it, we start off in the state of nature, where characterized by a war of each against all, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Everybody is struggling to survive all the time. But we have enough enlightened self-interest to recognize, oh, wait a second, if we all get together and make a pact, I agree to give up my right to kill you, you agree to give up your right to kill me, then we can all thrive better in that situation. So yes, we did lose some of our freedoms, but in exchange for that, we gained a lot of security and some protections, right? And we feel willing to take that bargain. Now, if you have that kind of view about what morality and the law and politics is, then it suggests that morality and the law and politics only make sense in a situation where everybody is a party to the contract, where we all have relatively equal power over each other, and we can understand what it is to make a contractual arrangement, and then we can agree to make that contractual arrangement and set up a system where we all have to follow the law and we can get punished if we break the law, right? And so in the past, this kind of contractarian argument has been used to exclude some human and non-human animals from the moral circle. And it could also be used to exclude present-day artificial intelligences from the moral circle, because the reality is that some human and non-human animals and perhaps many present-day artificial intelligences are not capable of being parties to a contract, are not capable of understanding them or agreeing to them, or they don't have as much power as we do. And so we don't have any incentive to give them rights for self-interested reasons, right? Now, many other philosophers and legal and political theorists think that is not the basis of morality and the law and politics. The actual basis of morality and the law and politics is just whether somebody is vulnerable, whether someone is sentient, whether they can feel pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering, because if they can, then their life matters to them. They care what happens to them. And that is reason enough for us to consider their interests when deciding how to treat them, and aspire to treat them with respect and compassion, even if we don't stand to gain anything from treating them that way. Now, I personally accept that view. I think that whether we have a moral obligation and whether we should build a state where we have a legal and political obligation to someone is not a matter of, do they have enough power to fight back against us? And so do we have self-interested reason to make a deal with them? It's instead simply, are they sentient? Are they vulnerable? Are our actions affecting them? If so, we should consider them and take those potential impacts seriously when deciding how to treat them. But now, that connects with the other aspect of your comment, which I thought was interesting, which is that in the future, even if humans disproportionately have power over non-human animals and AIs now, in the future, AIs might disproportionately have power over humans and other animals. We might reach a point where we cross the singularity, which is understood as the moment when AIs are going to match and then exceed human intelligence and other human capabilities. And that could happen quite fast and quite substantially, right? And so unlike with non-human animals, where we just kind of have a monopoly of power over them, and we can have that power over them perpetually, with artificial intelligences, as we develop them, they become increasingly more powerful, and at some point are going to be more powerful than us. And that is part of why I think questions about the moral circle and how we treat non-human animals and artificial intelligences are linked to the earlier questions that I mentioned and that you mentioned about AI safety and alignment, about building AIs that don't have the kinds of biases and ignorance that are going to get us into trouble when they become more powerful. Because you know what kind of attitude would get us into trouble when AIs become more powerful? We would get in trouble if AIs thought, hey, if I have power over you and I don't need to give you rights in order to have a good life myself, then screw it, I'm not going to give you rights, right? If they internalize that idea that we now currently have and apply to non-human animals in many cases, if they internalize that, then the second they become more powerful than us, they won't take themselves to have any reason to take care of us or treat us with respect and compassion, right? So if we continue to have that kind of social contract, contractualist, contractarian view, and we think we should give animals rights if we stand to gain something from it, we should give AIs rights if we stand to gain something from it. But if we don't stand to gain anything from it, forget about it. We can just treat them like objects, property, commodities. We can exploit and exterminate them as much as we like. If that remains our attitude, and if we give that attitude to them as we make them more sophisticated and program them and they become more powerful than us, then they're going to have that attitude to us, right? But if we instead cultivate the other type of attitude that I was recommending, if we instead think that no, the basis of our moral and legal and political obligations is someone as powerful as us, and do we stand to benefit from giving them rights? The question is just instead, do they have a life that matters to them? Are they sentient? Are they capable of happiness and suffering? Do they care what happens to them? If we treat that as a good enough reason to treat other animals and AIs with respect and compassion, and if those are the beliefs and values and practices that we program into AIs and that they inherit from us, then we are going to stand a better chance of surviving if and when they become more powerful than us. Now, again, there was more that I was planning to say, but I'll pause there since a discussion has more or less started. So go ahead.
You have these two premises. So one is the moral one, and the second one was the empirical one. So do you talk about the second one?
Sure. The empirical premise is very simple. The empirical premise is that artificial intelligences might not now have a non-negligible chance of being sentient, but in the future, they will have a non-negligible chance of being sentient. So right now, again, most artificial intelligences are very sophisticated in some ways, but very simple in other ways. Like a lot of these large language models are basically really good at pattern recognition, and they can draw from huge amounts of human writing. And by using those basic things, pattern recognition and drawing from human writing, and then some other features that are programmed into them, they can generate quite impressive speech and writing or images and so on and so forth. But we might think that is not a good enough reason to attribute sentience to them because more is needed for sentience. But in the future, there is no reason to expect that is going to remain the same, and things are developing at a really rapid pace. So in the future, it might well be the case that there are incredibly sophisticated artificial intelligences that are structurally and functionally similar to human and non-human animal brains. And I mentioned before the types of features they could have. They could have not only the capacity for perception and learning and memory and so on, but also the capacity for self-awareness, social awareness, language, reason, and various types of emotional states, an intuitive sense of curiosity, an intuitive sense of justice and fairness, an intuitive appreciation of beauty. These are all in principle features that we can program into artificial intelligences. And at a point where an artificially intelligent system with lots and lots, billions and billions of neurons has all of these capacities in the same kind of integrated way that we do, then the only question is whether a silicon-based system organized in that manner and capable of those behaviors and processes can be conscious and sentient in the same kind of way that a carbon-based system organized in that manner and capable of those behaviors and processes can be sentient and conscious. And the reality is that we can't at present be sure simply because of the problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is the idea that, you know, we really care about whether other beings are conscious and sentient, but the truth is the only mind that any of us can directly access is our own. So I can never know for sure if anyone else is conscious or sentient, including you. For all I know, all of you appear to be sentient, but might just be really sophisticated avatars in a simulation that I happen to be in. I might be in the Matrix and you're all agents in the Matrix and you appear to be sentient, but you're not, right? There's always a chance that could be true because the only conscious states that I can directly experience are mine. For the rest of you, I have to infer that you're sentient by making certain assumptions about the nature of the world and comparing our behavior and anatomy and evolutionary history and so on and so forth. So we can never know for sure if someone else is conscious or sentient. But if we do study other individuals' behavior and anatomy and evolutionary history and make certain basic assumptions about the world, like we all share the same reality and so on and so forth, then I can expect with a very high degree of confidence that all of you are sentient. And that is good enough for many other animals too. If those are our standards, then we should have a very high degree of confidence that all other vertebrates like mammals and fishes and reptiles and amphibians and birds are sentient, and even a pretty good degree of confidence that many invertebrates like octopuses and even insects are sentient. Maybe the chance that insects are sentient is only 20 or 40% as far as we can tell, but that's still enough for us to take seriously that we might be causing them suffering if we're killing them unnecessarily. And so if that's our standard, if my moral premise is correct, that just a mere 1% or 1 in 1,000 chance of being sentient is enough for me to at least have a responsibility to consider my impacts on you when deciding how to treat you, to extend you at least some moral consideration, then even if current AIs don't meet that standard, future AIs will. Within 10 or 20 or 30 years, there will be AIs that are sophisticated enough that there's at least a 1% chance, as far as we can tell, that they're sentient. And that means that in 10 or 20 or 30 years, we will coexist with artificial intelligences who merit moral consideration. Now, are they definitely going to be sentient? Not necessarily. Are they probably going to be sentient? Not necessarily. But is there a non-negligible chance that they're going to be sentient? Yes, there will be a non-negligible chance that they're going to be sentient. And that not only means that in 30 years humans should care about them, it means that right now we should care about them. If they definitely will exist, and if they might be sentient, then we should go ahead and start laying the groundwork for treating them with respect and compassion now. We should start cultivating those attitudes and putting systems in place to protect them now. So the conclusion of my argument is that we should actually extend not present artificial intelligences, but future artificial intelligences, moral standing now. We should treat future artificial intelligences, and not distant future ones. I'm talking a decade or 2 or 3 at most. We should treat those future artificial intelligences as though they matter now. And that means we should start putting systems in place now so that when the time comes, we are able to treat them with respect and compassion in the same kind of way that we should be preparing now to treat future generations of humans and non-human animals well. We should also be preparing now to treat future generations of artificial intelligence as well. So I see that Prafula has a hand up.
I had just a very quick comment. This is a very interesting talk, and you are really looking at it in a very interesting way. I would rather that you continue with it. But if after the talk, if you are interested and available, I would like to bring to your attention something that the Dalai Lama has written in his autobiography, which may be relevant to what you are saying. And that's
that would be wonderful. Absolutely, I would very much welcome that. I will.
That's all.
I will put my email address in the chat. You could also easily find it online.
Yeah, you can.
There's my email address.
You'll find his webpage and contact.
Yeah. So please do feel free to send me that. I would love to read it. And I also see that Abik has a hand up.
Hold on, you mute.
Oh, hey there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the audio is coming through.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, love the content, and I was thinking about with some of these ways that we can morally consider AI in the future. There's a paradigm shift that I'm really excited about, but as someone who's a computer scientist and building systems like these, that kind of the reproductive responsibility that we have for artificial intelligence over the biological systems that we create on a daily basis as a society. And so saying like, hey, in a biological case, we have nature that has kind of pre-configured humans, and we kind of got what we got when it comes to humans and animals and the sort. But how could we potentially consider these AIs that we're developing before we develop them, where we now have more flexibility in, hey, the experiences that we have for them, our intentionality and the ways that they're configured. And maybe how could people who are working on in these spaces to bring these artificial agents into existence, what could they be keeping in mind to be compassionate?
That's a great question. And this is something that I think we are not really ready to answer concretely yet, but I can offer a kind of abstract answer. And then I think the challenge for the research community is basically for ethicists and engineers to put their heads together, come together basically, and think together about what that might mean concretely. But the abstract answer, and this is one of those areas where we can learn from past experience with non-human animals, as you suggested, the abstract answer is to say, in general, when designing them, if we do bring them into existence at all, we need to ask first and foremost, what kind of features would it be good for them to have for their own sake, as opposed to merely asking ourselves, what kind of features would it be good for them to have for our sakes? So to draw from non-human animal examples, we currently bring lots of non-human animals into existence. We breed, more than 100 billion non-human animals per year for use in food and research and entertainment and companionship and other kinds of human purposes, right? And in all of those cases, we optimize for our own purposes, right? We breed them to have traits that are valuable for us instead of having traits that are valuable for them. So for example, we breed farmed animals to grow as big as possible, as fast as possible, to optimize for meat output, right? And we breed lab animals to have certain cancers so that we can perform research on those cancers. And we breed even companion animals, the ones that we see as family and friends and we love, we breed them often to have features that we see as cute, like smushed noses, even though those features cause respiratory problems and other health problems for the animals. And those are just examples. There are lots of other examples too. And if we really were treating animals with respect and compassion, we would probably bring many fewer of them into existence. We wouldn't be farming them at the scale that we do, or conducting research on them at the scale that we do, or even breeding them for companionship at the scale that we do, right? So we would be bringing fewer of them into existence. But then insofar as we do bring them into existence, we would also be bringing them to existence on their own terms. We would be creating them so that they can have lives that are good for them, rather than have lives that are instrumentally useful for us and bad for them, right? And so I am not enough of an engineer to understand what the best examples of that are going to be when the time comes for artificial intelligences, but I can imagine certain forms it can take. For example, some current research on artificial intelligences involves the same type of reinforcement learning that some non-human subjects research, animal research uses. So in other words, we help AIs to learn by giving them experiences and incentives, so like negative or positive incentives. So they do a thing and then it gives them negative input and they learn not to do that, and they and over time you can get the right behaviors that way. This is the same way we've often trained non-human animals. So that would be one example where designing a system so that they learn through negative reinforcement, through that kind of negative feedback, would potentially be not the best way to set it up if we were trying to give them a life that was good for them. But as far as other examples are concerned, that's where I need AI experts to help as part of the conversation. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but if not, I'd be happy to talk more.
I have a question that today we have, to have rights and to be considered by humans, you don't need to be sentient or human. For instance, today the corporations have rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
The corporation can be sued by corporations, and these corporations might not have any real owners, right? It could be some common shareholders and so on. So how do you articulate this? So a corporation is probably not sentient, right? And then in other domains, you have not corporation, but you have algorithms, right? So people who do interact with the blockchain, they under contract with algorithms. There's nobody out there, but there's some obligations. You have some contractual agreements and so on. So how do you put this in there? And so they are not humans and they are not sentient.
Right. So this is where we get into the legal and political realm. So I'll address this question briefly, and then Abik, we can go back to you in just a few minutes. So to address this question briefly, first of all, I am open to sentience not being necessary for moral and legal and political standing. My talk is based on the assumption that sentience is necessary because if we get rid of that assumption, it makes my conclusion even easier to establish. If we think that there are multiple routes to having rights and you don't need sentience to have rights, then it becomes even easier to show that we should extend rights to future artificial intelligences. So I was making things a little bit harder for myself, but if you want to get rid of that assumption, then all the better for my conclusion, right? But now, to address your question about legal and political rights. So at present, under United States law and in many other jurisdictions as well, there are only two kinds of basic legal status that a being can have. A being can either be a legal person, which means that you have a capacity for rights that are appropriate for your needs and interests, or you can be a legal thing, which means that you lack the capacity for any rights at all. And at present, all and only humans and some stand-ins for human interests like corporations and algorithms count as persons. Now, the reason I put it this way is as follows. We give legal personhood to humans. So we say that humans can have rights that are appropriate for our needs and interests, right? We have a right to life, liberty, and property, and so on. And we say that corporations and certain algorithms are persons in some jurisdictions for some purposes. But that does not mean that we think they matter for their own sakes and that we owe them duties for their own sakes, right? We don't believe that a corporation has intrinsic moral value and we owe the corporation respect and compassion, nor do we think that about the kinds of algorithms that are operating in self-driving cars, right? The reason we extend them personhood is it's a kind of extension of humans' personhood. We give corporations personhood because it's a useful way of utilizing the rights and responsibilities that the individuals within that corporation have. And we give certain algorithms personhood in limited ways because that's a way of assigning responsibility to humans when there are accidents for self-driving cars, right? What we don't yet have in the United States is a case where a non-human has been granted legal personhood for their own sake because we take them to matter. Although we are getting closer. So I'll just say a couple of things about this and then we'll go to Abik. The Non-Human Rights Project is a nonprofit organization whose lawyers have been advocating for non-human animal personhood and rights. And so in 2018, they brought a case to the New York Court of Appeals on behalf of two chimpanzees, Kiko and Tommy, where they said these chimpanzees are being held in solitary confinement in roadside zoos, and they have a right to habeas corpus and a right to be removed and placed in sanctuaries. Now, that case was not taken up by the New York Court of Appeals, but there was one judge, Judge Fahey, who wrote a 7-page opinion saying, look, we didn't take the case, but a lot of these arguments are compelling. It really is not just that non-human animals, simply in virtue of not being human, are being denied any kind of basic rights at all under the law. And there is going to come a time when we have to reckon with our exclusion of them. They clearly are autonomous, clearly are sentient, clearly have lives that matter to them and relationships with us that matter. And we ought to have legal obligations to them, and they ought to have some kinds of legal claims and rights against us. And we're going to need to figure out how to make sense of that. And then this year, the same organization, the Non-Human Rights Project, brought a case in front of the New York Court of Appeals on behalf of Happy the elephant, who's at the Bronx Zoo. And that time, the New York Court of Appeals did take up the case. They heard it. They ultimately decided in favor of the Bronx Zoo against the Non-Human Rights Project, but there were two dissenting opinions where once again, the judges said, we think that there's something to this and non-humans should be counted as persons for their own sake and have rights for their own sake. So we haven't recognized it yet in the United States, but I think we will gradually build momentum towards that. And there will come a time where we grant non-humans personhood, not just because they're corporations or algorithms who are kind of extended human agents, but actually because we take them to be sentient and to morally matter for their own sakes and to have the capacities that are sufficient for legal rights. So I think that's going to happen and we should work towards it, but it hasn't happened yet. So let's go to Abik now.
Yeah, Abik, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's so many cool non-human rights projects, especially in the UK and with the cephalopod sentient stuff. And I'm like,
yeah.
Great progress.
Yeah, so it was based on what we were talking about before. I couldn't unmute, but your previous answer answered it really well. The question about reproductive responsibility, and I received it like, oh, yeah, making sure that when we bring an artificial agent into existence, making sure that their existence is good for them and worth it for them. And of course, because these are machines, they will be the result of human intention, whereas, animals and the other sort, like, we're kind of already there. With these ones, yes, they will be here for, human purposes, but also making sure that their life is good for them. There's a lot of literature that I'm sure that you are very well read on like quality of life, and saying like, oh, okay, yes, this animal or this system is suffering, but is their life still as a whole worth it? And how do those questions be approached? And so, yeah, in a way where saying, oh, we built this AI, it suffers a lot, but it doesn't kill itself, and it doesn't say that its life isn't worth it. Is that okay? Or should we, also in some way optimize for not having it suffer on top of it, not finding its existence not worth it?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Abhi. That's such a good question. And so let me just say a little bit more about that. But before I said we should, if we bring them into existence at all, we should design them to have features that are good for them rather than features that are purely good for us, right? And in the case of animals, again, the lesson that we have learned is that we made lots of moral mistakes. We should be bringing many fewer of them into existence in the first place, and to the degree that we do, we should be, again, empowering them to have lives that are good for them. Okay, but then your question is, how high is that bar, right? Is it enough to ensure that they have a net positive existence? In other words, that they experience more pleasure than pain, and they don't actively want to die, or is the bar higher than that, right? Now, I think it would be a step in the right direction if we simply committed to giving everyone we bring into existence a net positive life, a life that contains more pleasure than pain. But you could ask whether that is enough. So, for example, suppose that I am a scientist and I would very much like to improve the healthcare situation in this country. Not nearly enough people have access to life-saving medical interventions. And so my bright idea is I'm going to clone a bunch of humans and keep them in my basement, keep them chained in my basement, so that they can be on standby in case people need organs, right? So I'll clone a bunch of humans, keep them chained in my basement, but give them lives that are comfortable enough so that they have more pleasure and pain, right? Like, they can't make any decisions, they can't go choose their own lives or anything like that, but they can watch TV, they can play video games, I give them decent tasting food, but I keep them chained in my basement. And when somebody needs an organ, I'm gonna go kill one of them and take their organs and allocate it to other people, right? Now, that might be a situation where I have done enough to ensure that these humans who are chained in my basement have lives that contain more pleasure than pain. But I think many of us, hopefully, I hope that many of us would think that is not good enough. I am still treating them badly by bringing them into existence in this purely instrumentalizing, exploitative way. And when I bring them into existence, not giving them the freedom that they need and the resources that they need to go choose their own lives and live full, complete, happy human lives where they can flourish as much as reasonably possible. By bringing them into existence and not giving them that, I've done them a disservice, and this is exploitative and objectifying and wrong, right? And if that's our attitude in the human case, then we should at least consider the possibility that it should be our attitude in the non-human animal and AI case. So maybe it's not good enough when we give a farmed pig more pleasure than pain in their life, right? That might be better than factory farming. Factory farming gives them more pain than pleasure. It's clearly wrong, right? But even on a smaller farm where we let them live for 3 years and we give them more pleasure and pain, but then we kill them when we want their body parts, maybe that's not good enough, right? And similarly, if we bring an AI into existence and we want to use some negative reinforcement, but we also make sure they have enough sources of pleasure so that if they're sentient, their lives will be net positive. Maybe that's not good enough either. Maybe we should take the same standards that we apply to the creation of humans, that if we create them at all, then we need to really give them everything they need to have the best life they can possibly have. If that's the standard for humans, then maybe that should be the standard for non-humans too.
But this is, I think this is a good point. But this is a theory, because in practice, we don't treat all humans, equally, and we don't. I mean, there are 7 billion humans on this planet.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Many of them are miserable, right? Like hunger, poverty, disease, and so on, right? So
Oh, definitely.
we don't even treat like fellow humans, well, with some of them. So
Yeah.
how could we extend the same thing to the AI? Like we say, okay, you treat the AI so well, but when like normal humans, they die of hunger, of disease, and so on,
Right.
because they are very far from us, right? We don't see them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll reply to that briefly, and then we can let Adria have the final question of the session. So to brief, yes, absolutely. Human rights are still a major work in progress. We have made a lot of progress towards human rights, right? Following World War II, United Nations offered various universal human rights declarations that said all humans merit respect and compassion and dignity simply in virtue of being human. And, given the history of our species, that was a major achievement. Now, have we fully lived up to those declarations? No. As you note, billions of humans are still living in poverty. Millions and millions of humans are still incarcerated. And all sorts of injustice and inequality exists in society: racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, classism. Again, all of these forms of discrimination and oppression exist. Now, I think what that means is that we need to be treating humans much better. We need to be treating ourselves in ways that live up to our ideals. And then we need to be treating non-human animals the same way, and artificial intelligences too. But what I will insist on is that we should not wait until we have solved all problems for humans before we start considering the needs of non-human animals and AIs too. Because first of all, we're never going to fully solve all problems for humans. Injustice and oppression is always going to be an ongoing thing that we need to resist and work to overcome. So if we wait to fix everything for humans before we start considering non-humans, then that is a license to never consider non-humans. But second of all, we can do this at the same time. Just like we can work on racism and sexism at the same time, we can work on human and non-human oppressions at the same time. And in fact, our work benefits from doing those things at the same time, because human and non-human oppression are linked. Part of how we oppress humans is by comparing them with non-humans who we frame as lesser than. And so if we address some of the root causes of these issues, the idea that somebody is lesser than simply because they look and act differently from me, then that can actually make it easier to address human oppressions rather than harder. So yeah, we definitely still have a long way to go for humans too. But I think that's a reason why we should just redouble our efforts for humans and then include non-humans in those efforts as well. So Adria, you'll have the last word.
Adria?
Hi,
Okay.
I've been following your work for some time now, and I'm very grateful for all of it. I think it's great. I have two questions. The first one is very short. What's your take or your view on Luke Roloff's recent proposal of motivational sentientism? And the second question is, whether creating AIs or sentient sims, like the ones like maybe Bostrom or Chalmers have proposed or talked about, would it ever be permissible to create them in a way that they die in the end? Because it would be different from having children. Once you have a child, you do not control when the child dies or not. But when creating sims or artificial intelligences, you can program them to die, and it wouldn't be death. You would be killing them. So yeah, would this ever be permissible?
Got it. So those are both great questions. So I'll say one brief thing about the first one, and then one slightly less brief, but still quite brief thing about the second one. So what I'll say about the first one is I'm not familiar with Luke Roloff's motivational sentientist view, although I would very much like to be, because I think Luke is a really, really smart person. And Luke and I are actually collaborating on a separate project about the nature and value of connected minds. And if AIs have connected minds because they exist as part of vast neural networks, then how would that change the kind of welfare and rights and autonomy and other types of moral features that they would have. So I think Luke is very, very smart and would like to learn more about their work on motivational sentientism. But since I don't know much about it and time is limited, I'll just pass on that question for now. But with respect to your second question, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know what to say about it right now. And I think it just illustrates how lots of ethical questions are going to look really different once AIs are potential moral subjects too, because you're right, with human and non-human animals, mortality was always taken for granted, and the loss of control over someone's life once they come into existence was always to some degree taken for granted, except in the case of factory farmed animals and lab animals and so on. But with artificial minds, where we can control every aspect of what their life is going to be like, and if and when they die, then we do have to ask, is it permissible to bring them into existence such that they have a certain amount of pleasure and a certain amount of pain, and then they die at a certain pre-specified time, right? Now, that will really relate to the question we were just talking about. What is the bar for it being okay to bring someone into existence, right? Does it just have to be that they have more pleasure than pain, or do they have to have a lot more pleasure than pain? Because where you set that bar is going to determine when it is okay to bring someone into existence. Now, if it is okay to bring humans and non-human animals into existence, knowing that we all are destined to die, then I think it can be okay to bring an AI into existence, knowing that they are destined to die as well. But it really is tricky when you specifically make it the case that they are going to die when you could have done otherwise. It's just a great question, and I'll have to think more about what my answer is, which is just a good sign that this is an ethical issue that we really need to be thinking about more, because so many novel questions like this are going to come up. So thank you for that. That's really interesting. Okay,
we're running out of time, but so thank you very much, Professor Sebo, Jeff. It was a great talk, fascinating topics, and I hope you come back, one day, maybe when your book is published, talk about
that would be great.
All these things. And I think the audience is very engaged. So thanks, everyone. Just an announcement that the next talk will be on October 26th. It'll be on empirical studies of conflict. It'll be Professor Eli Berman from UCSD who will talk about how you use the data to study wars and conflicts. It'll be also an interesting topic. So thank you very much for your talk. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a good night. Okay.
Thanks everybody. This was really fun.